Rhonda Zimlich. Rhonda enjoys living in the rainy Pacific Northwest. She is an MFA candidate in fiction at Vermont College, where she's also a reader for Hunger Mountain. She's a long-standing member of the Lane Literary Guild, where she facilitates the workshop group, Pros and Cons. Her work has appeared in publications such as Acorn Review, Crow Pie, Icarus Down, and the anthology Ink Stain. I have more to read here. Rhonda, I've read. Okay, tonight Rhonda will be reading from Ignorance Is. Here's what the editor of Ink Stains had to say about the story. Hearkening to Marquez's "A very old man with enormous wings," said Beckett's Waiting for Godot, Rhonda Zimlich, Ignorance is an artful contemporary allegory about being careful what you wish for. Zimlich's protagonist becomes an existential freak show in hope of the arrival of that which she most desires. Even her initial horrific sacrifice eats away at her body, mind, and soul. So, welcome, Rhonda.
So I want to thank Joan, thanks so much, and also I just want to say what an honor it is to read with Jen and Sarah. This really is amazing, and the readings have been fantastic. And also I want to just throw a shout out to the Lane Literary Guild. I am a member, and I really appreciate so much the network of writers that I've been introduced to over the years. This piece is coming out in an anthology. I chose to read it tonight. Not just because my friend TK asked me to, but that's a big reason, but also because the anthology was supposed to be released this last week, and I would have had copies here for you, but as these things go, the release date got pushed back to January 31st, so Tuesday you can get it on Amazon. It's called, the anthology is called Ink Stains Volume 7. I did not know I was a horror writer, but it's a horror anthology. And I wrote this as a metaphor to abuse. I write a lot about abuse. I wrote this as a metaphor about being in an abusive relationship. And turns out it's also a horror story. Go figure. The title is Ignorance Is. Steadying herself near the edge of the fire escape on the 14th floor, Rainey Mariski dared to look down at the place she guessed she would hit, a gray rectangle of sidewalk, darker than the neighboring sections. Her stomach lurched at the smallness of the street below. Gripping the railing, she lifted her eyes to the horizon, scanning the erect blocks of skyscrapers and the silvery harbor beyond, and fought the tug of a sudden updraft, her wings tucked closely to her back. Yes, she had wings. Giant, awkward, cumbersome. Each wing was more than 6 feet long with a featherless span of mottled, flesh-colored latex. When she extended them, which she rarely did, they stretched across the room. They protruded above her head by a foot when she stood straight. The membranes trailed behind her like a veil, as close to a bridal train as she might ever know. By the way, I'm abridging, so I'm scrolling. Sharp gusts of wind came in sporadic bursts, then fell to hushed whirls as the sounds of the traffic below filled the audible void. The cold, smog-choked air of the city pulled and pushed at her form. Tears chilled as soon as they formed and rolled downward to match the numbness of Rainey's cheeks. The railing where her hands gripped had become slick with her palms sweat. Her fingers ached. She returned to the idea over and over again of surrendering to the urge to let go. She felt fleeting optimism to overcome and allow her desire to fly, to replace the regret and terror. But success might be worse now. A distant shrill and clang of breaking glass and crashing steel startled Rainey. The noise was uncanny, Two cars had collided at an intersection out of sight. The sound came from somewhere far down below her on the busy streets of downtown San Diego. Another crash of glass brought everything back. A white plate slipped from the waiter's hand just as he turned to set it on the table. It landed with a shattering racket that froze the other restaurant patrons mid-mingle. "I'm so sorry," the waiter apologized. He bent together the fragments of broken china from the floor near Rainey's feet, taking extra care to pinch the slivers of porcelain that had fallen into the cracks of the concrete veranda. "It's nothing," Rainey smiled, forgiving the slip. She hoped her date would notice her kind patience. "I will return with another plate of nigiri." They were having dinner at a sushi bar in La Jolla, a quaint coastal community near the University of California campus. They sat outside on the veranda overlooking the inky blue Pacific. The ocean breeze was cool, but the sake was warm. "You're lovely, you know that?" Gary cooed as he poured another cup of sake. He reached across the table to move a strand of hair from Rainey's eyes. "What if you could do something amazing?" He grinned like a cat. She smiled as she chewed, the flavor of salmon taking her back to her childhood in Seattle, but she pushed the thought away. The pain of her dad's absence would not mix well with this moment. She managed. Gary didn't seem to need her response anyway. "I've been working on new patches of myelin sheathing at the base molecular level of nerves. It's pretty amazing what we can do with stem cells, though I wouldn't let the word out just yet." He offered another piece of nigiri. Rainey covered her mouth with her napkin, pretending to still chew a bit. "Stem cell research will be a tangle of controversy in the new millennium, I'm sure of it, but the 1990s are all about me." "I see." Rainey, playing along, cocked an eyebrow. He tipped his head and said, "Curiosity is in our nature, and I intend to exploit that to its fullest capacity. No matter what happens, you can't stifle curiosity." "And what are you curious about, Doctor?" she asked. "There's this new organic compound that actually fuses inorganic connections to nerves." He made joining gestures with his hands that Rainey found provocative. "I'm sure you've heard some of the talk about bionics. They're able to get connective tissues to fuse with internal prosthetics made of coral. Have you heard of that?" "I have, well, a little." She sipped the sake again, feeling lightheaded from its effect and a little embarrassed that she wasn't more up to date on stem cell research. "Well, let me spare you the tedious details." He smirked, topping off Rainey's sake again. His curvy mouth was irresistible. "Let's just say that this newest technology has bionics at such a high level of operation that prosthetic fingers can grasp paintbrushes, allowing some of my patients to create elaborate works of art, even paint their own toenails. This will revolutionize bionics." Gary clapped his hands with a bang. Rainey looked around to see if anyone was looking at them. He lowered his voice. "The first thing I should make very clear is how important it is that we keep a wrap on what I have planned." He sipped his sake. "Meaning?" Rainey leaned in, allowing just enough rise in her eyebrows to seem interested, but not enough to show her eagerness. "Let's just say that ignorance is bliss. Besides, there will be plenty to say once we reveal what I have been able to do, what we have been able to do after we've done it." "So ignorance is bliss?" Rainey asked. "That's hardly a medical perspective." "Contraire," Gary smiled, reaching his hand up again to brush away her hair, only this time he rested his fingers on Rainey's cheek for a small second. "So smart," he sighed. Her heart skipped. "I'm sure you've heard about the physics of bumblebees." "What do bumblebees have to do with bionics?" "Bumblebees have to do with impossibilities, and ignorance being bliss, and the miracles of nature." He downed his sake and launched into what he'd been building up to. "Bumblebees don't know their limitations. They don't know that their tiny wings are too small for their bulky bodies. They don't know that the laws of physics deny them their birthright of flying. But bumblebees don't care about physics. They fly regardless, and they excel at it." "Nice," Rainey said. "One of the most brilliant medical minds of this end of the century, and you want to anthropomorphize bees? I can see you've thought this all out." "Don't be like that." Gary sat back in his chair and pouted like a spoiled child not getting a favorite toy. Sorry, it's the sake. She gave her best eye back and tipped her head. Rainey could play too, and she was enjoying the extra attention. Besides that, he had once given her a sample of a new opiate, something to give her a little insight into what might be available to pain victims. Rainey was more than willing to see what other treats might come her way if she played along. Please continue. Well, most bees, in fact most insects in the family Apidae, are not supposed to be able to fly by the laws of physics, our laws. Their wings are too small for their large bodies, as I've already said, and yet they fly. He paused and took a bite of his food. Tell me how this relates to bionics, she purred, stroking his knuckles with her thumb. Gary furrowed his brow. I'm not sure I should continue. Rainey felt the sting of rejection. Embarrassed, she pulled her hand back and sat upright. But Gary relented. His tone softened a bit, and he reached forward and now took her hand in both of his. I'll tell you, but I need you to promise me you can keep a secret. I can. Rainey leaned toward him, pleading with her tone. Holding her hands tighter, his words came in an urgent whisper. How would you like to fly? Feeling dizzier, Rainey gave herself to his words and his grasp. Right then, she would have promised Gary anything. She would have flown over the moon for him, with or without wings. Wings. She awoke to the sound of breaking glass. A slanted room through her blurred vision challenged her to make sense of recent events. Only a blink and the pain registered in her neck, back, shoulders, wings. Well, not really in her wings. It was the same each day for Rainey. She returned to the hell and her nightmare with each new dawn, and each time she awoke, she fought it until she sat forward, her prosthetic wings unfurling behind her. Only after the world came into focus would she accept her predicament, if only for another 16 hours or so. At least she had a button. She pressed it. The pain subsided and the sharpness of the lines in the room softened. Once Gary had told her that the button was linked to morphine along with some other goodies. Rainey didn't care anymore what was in the IV, as long as it did the trick, as long as it killed the pain in her body, in her heart, and it did, mostly. Next, she would look for her morning meal. Today, a delivery of day-old bagels and cold coffee sat on the table near the door. There was lox, too, which meant that Gary would not return that day. He skipped a visit when he provided protein in the morning. Typical, Rainey thought as she dragged herself across the room. She gripped the pole of the IV station, moving it with her as she walked, the tips of her wings trailing on the ground just behind her, pulling shards of glass along the wet floor. This wasn't like a bad haircut that would grow out. It wasn't like a tattoo that Rainey could pay an expensive plastic surgeon to remove. Her wings were very permanent now. They weighed 40 pounds and were anchored to her shoulder blades, vertebrae, and backs of her ribs with stainless steel pins and rivets. Rainey's scapula had been rebuilt with extensions that protruded from her body. The network of diodes, wires, and devices controlling her wings was cumbersome and difficult to haul around, so Gary had designed a special belt with a pack that could be anchored to the center of her lower back and secured with a harness. She removed the belt when sleeping or when Gary wasn't around, which was most of the time now. She let the tangle of wires and cables hang free, dragging around behind her. Gary said the belt was for flight, or if she ever wanted to leave the hotel room. She never wanted to leave the hotel room, and she had never flown. The room was on the 14th floor of an abandoned hotel and a penthouse suite of a once popular tourist area in downtown San Diego. She had a view of the old waterfront. The newer section of town was just to the south, where great skyscrapers were being erected by the dozens. Hungry developers and their greedy contracts swirled through the waterfront district like pesky seagulls, but just a mile in, the old downtown section was quiet, what Gary called the perfect town, telling Rainey that this hotel in particular had just the right altitude and seclusion. Rainey did not wonder about his need for privacy. Here she could scream as loud as she needed, and it would startle only the pigeons. There was no rescue, and little release. The relief Rainey got came from the drugs. These were given so that she could operate within a tolerable level of pain. The side effects were inhibiting at best and quite debilitating. Rainey didn't mind. She had become like Gary's well-behaved lab rat, patiently awaiting her next treat, smacking her button whenever the moment called for it. Any minute now, she could feel it coming on again. When there were additional surgeries or major adjustments, she welcomed the rewards of stronger drugs and larger doses. Rainey looked forward to such times, but not just for the drugs. During those times, Gary would stay longer, sometimes even for days. There was an additional room with a nice bed. Gary would bring chess. Rainey had come to anticipate those additional surgeries, each new perfection bringing them one step closer to the miracle of flight and her closer to him, if only temporarily. It was hard for her to understand, but she still wanted to make Gary happy. More than anything, she wanted to please him. She wanted to fly, she told herself. She wanted to do something amazing, to be a part of something extraordinary. She had certain fears, sure, but there was also a sense of dignity that came with something of this magnitude. Once Rainey had her bagel and cold coffee, she sat on a stool near a cluttered table, her shoulders hunched and her wings slouched. Rainey pulled her feet up onto the crossbar between the stool legs. She cupped her bagel and nibbled mouse-like, resting her elbows on her bent knees, all the while staring across the room at one particular item as if her gaze could penetrate it, evaporate it, or make it less real. The door. A strange urge came over Rainey to swoop up a sheet around her wings like a grand cloak and make for the elevator. She played the fantasy out, telling herself that she would gain superhero notoriety and fame, if even on foot. She looked to where the tether of the IV needle was taped to her arm. She imagined removing it herself. She had seen Gary do it so many times, so it was nothing for her to match his motions. I'm going to skip now to right when she first has the first surgery. The upright post of the glass IV had toppled before Gary could catch it, and the IV bottle hit the floor with a crash. Rainey's body spasmed in an involuntary jolt on the gurney, and her wing caught the lead. "Try to move them slowly," Gary growled. The young Latino orderly rushed into the room and righted the IV post. He moved quickly to change the bottle and clean the spill. Rainey caught him sneaking a glimpse at her. Something about his glance made her feel ashamed. The young man's eyes fell to the floor as he turned to leave the room, and he spoke the soft words, "Angelita de Grandezales." She fought the bleary haze that held her, but she could not clearly discern her whereabouts as she crawled out of her drug-induced haze. The walls were sterile white, yet she had the sense that the place was not a new facility. It was hospital-like, that much she knew from the sounds and smells. Some places had that air about them. It smelled of Lysol and bleach and other attempts to wash away soiled things. "Where am I?" she slurred. "Somewhere where I can take good care of you," she heard Gary explain. Now I'm going to skip a whole bunch. She has a bunch of flashbacks. She has a roommate named Marta who prays to a glass crucifix. She makes good friends with Emilio, begging, "Más morfina, por favor." She wants more morphine. Slumping on her stool, Rainey pulled the IV needle out of her arm. She wished she would have pulled it out faster because the motion made her lightheaded. She taped the cotton in place and took several more intentional breaths. The door swirled into focus. "See," Rainey said out loud, "if I can do this, I can go out." She stood, securing the belt and harness. She stuffed the pack with all the wires, diodes, and batteries and wrapped it around her waist. She reached for the bed sheet. In her hands, the cotton was soothing and soft. She held up the cloth and draped it around herself, concealing as much of the wings as possible and securing it at the nape of her neck. She took a long look in the mirror. The room swam as she turned to check all angles of the sheet's fit. Somehow, the sheet looked just fine, even though Rainey did not. She looked ominous, like a prize-winning costume at Halloween. Her skin was pale and her eyes were sunken, outlined in dark circles. She had done her best these last few months to get her weight down, having given up 2 meals per day for supplements and beverages that Gary had developed for weight loss. His chemical therapy program had also taken its toll. She could see it in her hair. The once vibrant chestnut color had faded to a dull, mousy brown, and it had thinned. Her image made her sad, and she touched her face under her eyes where the dark color showed the outline of her skull beneath. Hollow bones were not an option. The changes in her diet were necessary. Who was all she could say before the tears came, but she pushed it away. Rubbing the spot on her arm where she had removed the IV, she longed for her button. She grabbed a bottle of pills and stuffed them into the pack with the wires. Then she set out the door, grabbing the old metal hotel room key from the hook before she left. The elevator opened and she clambered in. She pulled her wings in around her. The button panel was dingy and the metal was tarnished and old. But the button for 14 was rubbed shiny and new from excessive and recent use. She pressed the button marked L, also worn clean, and started to descend into the unknown. Her stomach sank, but she insisted to herself that it was just anticipation, and hope. She must still have had some hope then. She stood as tall as she could and lifted her head to watch the lights count down her floors. 12, a sense of eagerness began to mount. She hadn't come up with a plan. 11, she thought if she had money, she would go to the deli up on A Street. 10, maybe just going out to the street would be enough. 9, she needed a pill. 8, she noticed that the dirty panel had 3 buttons that were worn clean. The 14th floor, the 7th floor, and the 1st floor. She pushed the 7. The elevator stopped and the doors opened with a rickety shutter. Rainey peered down a long, sterile hallway punctuated with closed doors. The floors were stark linoleum and the walls were painted a sterile white. Rainey could detect a slight smell of Lysol and bleach. She stepped from the elevator and walked up the hall in careful steps. Silence overwhelmed her, and yet she continued. She peered into a small window set into one of the doors. She saw a dark room with what appeared to be an exam table. Rainey shook it off, but a strange thought had started to creep into her mind. It had yet to fully form. She crossed the hall and looked into another small window and a door. The window was blocked by something covering it from the inside. She tried the handle, afraid she was meddling, but too curious about her developing thoughts to ignore the impulse. The handle gave, and she pulled the door open. Rainey's eyes burned at once as the smell of rancid meat overpowered her senses. She gagged and covered her mouth. She started to turn away, but stopped. The large room spanning before her had been gutted of furniture and familiar interior features. Rainey saw, amidst wires, diodes, and batteries, a dozen pairs of prosthetic wings, each made of artificial, fleshy, mottled gray material, wings much like her own. Some dangled from hooks along the exposed rafters. Others were lying on examination tables near collections of surgical instruments and medical equipment, and one set was crumpled on the floor against the wall. They were each just like Rainey's wings, with one distinct difference. Each hanging version had a human spinal column attached to it. The spinal columns were in varying stages of rot, and each had a different set of hardware attached, but there were no bodies, at least no complete bodies. There were only wings and vertebrae and the thick, putrid smell of decay. As she turned to run, Rainey's eyes caught on a simple crucifix hanging on the wall near the door, Marta's. She rushed back to the elevator and pressed the call button over and over until the doors opened with a slow whoosh. Inside, she pressed the 14th floor button, abandoning her idea to venture outside. Back upstairs, she threw the stool against the window, shattering the great glass wall that separated her from the fire escape ledge, knowing her wings would not fit through the tiny window. Glass exploded, tiny shards and enormous pieces, all razor sharp and devastating. Rainey saw it all so clearly. Before climbing out onto the fire escape, she knew what Carrie had been trying to make her see all along. It was plain then how well played this entire affair had been. She would fly, one way or another. Even if his experiment was deemed a modern-day Frankenstein nightmare, it would make people wonder about possibilities. You can't stifle curiosity, they would say, just as Gary had said on that fateful night of bliss so long ago. Once outside, she had time to think it through, standing there on the ledge of the 14th floor of the El Cortez. She had to be the one to initiate it in the beginning, just as she had to be the one to climb out onto the ledge. He could never put her there himself, not directly. How many others had sat across dinner tables just like that one, sharing sake, having that same conversation? How would you like to fly? How fine-tuned that performance had become. She played right into it, eating the seeds from his hand like a starving starling. She had seen him over those last few months adjusting the networks and wires and connections on her wings and back, and she knew he had a talent for minute details, for working backward to achieve his objective. She was certain of it. What she was uncertain of, and what made her sick to imagine, was how many had come before her. Gary's words echoed in her head and in her heart. Ignorance is bliss. Just like the bumblebee, Rainey could never know that she could not fly. A pair of doves landed on the railing near her. She looked from them to her feet. This was the first time she recognized the pain in her sliced toes and heels, blood seeping from the small glass cuts. She felt a mounting sting and burn from the unseen recesses of her soles. A trail of red marked the path she had taken from the window and along the ledge. Rainey had a fleeting thought that she could stay, climb off her perch and find help, survive long enough to see the man brought to justice. At least there would be no more victims, no visits with other young nurses or co-eds or waitresses, whoever they were, no more trips to Mexico or sushi bars, and no future occupants here on the 14th floor. Maybe Gary already had another prospect. Maybe she was lovely too, charming and smart, but only smart enough, and hopeful, but only hopeful enough. And then the great lie of the entire ordeal stripped the last bit of her sanity, and so she spread her huge wings, holding their span wide, the latex taut against the wind gusts and the pain. Rainey leaned forward, the cold updraft taking her breath away. She stretched her large wings further, spreading them to their greatest, most glorious length for the first time. Then she let go.
Oh, good.